Okay.
More people.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to ask people to please mute unless we will have some time to ask questions. But I want to give you a little bit of background about our speaker today. And our speaker is Lian Najami. And she is the first Israeli Arab to win the Rhodes Scholarship. And she's going to share a unique perspective in life in Israel, minorities and shared existence, based on her experiences growing up in a liberal Muslim family, attending a Christian high school, and volunteering in a Reformed Jewish community center. So she's grew up as part of 4 different minority groups in Israel. She's a woman, an Arab, a Muslim, and a person with a disability. And this proved to be a catalyst, triggering a drive to pursue social justice and create a more inclusive society, fueling an ambition to promote minority rights and motivating Lian to develop impactful initiatives for minority populations, both at home and abroad. By introducing us to the multiple minority groups that coexist in Israel, she hopes to raise awareness to the importance of inclusivity policies and explore the shifting currents that underpin Arab-Israeli relations. Lian does not present a perfect image of Israel, but rather explores the nuances, addressing both the opportunities and the challenges facing minority communities in Israel. By celebrating the diversity while simultaneously addressing the issues that exist, her exploration of a modern Israel is what makes her an engaging speaker. So very happy to introduce Lian Najami.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Singer, and thank you all for coming to today's talk. First of all, I just wanted to say, obviously, knowing that Pesach is just around the corner, wishing you all happy holidays on that occasion, and I hope that you have a good Seder, of course, Seder Sameach. So first of all, for me, it's a pleasure to be able to engage with everyone. And the way it's gonna be basically today is I'll give a short presentation on the minority groups that exist in Israel and share a little bit of my own story of growing up as a non-Jew in a Jewish state. And in fact, as an Arab minority within a very mixed neighborhood in Haifa. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open it for more of a discussion and a Q&A session to have with those that are present here today. And of course, if anyone who will be watching it later on through the recording, I'm sorry that we weren't able to connect live through this event, but do feel free to reach out later, be it through the email, and Rabbi Singer, please feel free to share the email as well, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions on that email address as well. So to kind of take you back, I guess, and go back to just my childhood itself and growing up in Enayam Wadijmal, which is a mixed neighborhood situated at the shore in Haifa. It's a beautiful neighborhood that's about mixed 50-50%. And I always joke around telling people that it was never a case of trying to, have a governmental experiment to see whether people can share their existence from various minority groups, but it just naturally happened. And it has been kind of the main mindset, or I would say the main stepping stone towards the mindset that I've had over the past years to do with shared existence. I grew up with a neighborhood that had the full spectrum of the Israeli society, be it from Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs, Druze, as well as from the Jewish population, to have Ethiopian Jews, Russian Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews. My building, and as well as actually an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva that's situated right in the middle of our neighborhood. In fact, my building that I grew up in was 8 flats. 3 out of those flats were Arabs, both Christian and Muslims, and then the rest of them, the 5 other flats, were populated by, and still are actually, by a Russian Jewish family, 2 Iraqi Mizrahi Jews, as well as two Ashkenazi Jewish families, one of which is actually a Holocaust survivor as well. And so growing up, that was kind of the environment that I was a part of. And it was such a great opportunity for me to have these positive encounters from such a young age. About the ages of 4 to 5, I was basically befriending my neighbors, who one of which actually is Rita, and she was my best friend from a very young age until today. And Rita is from a Russian Jewish family. And I remember meeting her at the age of 4, and we would just go and play in the playground. And for me, that positive encounter, even though at that age probably didn't seem as much, except for two girls who are playing together, later on it proved pivotal in my understanding of mixed of mixed, as well as having minority and different people from different ethnic backgrounds. And what I mean about that is, when I went on later in life and I was in an Arabic speaking school or in Arabic communities, as well as for Rita, from my conversations with her, we would often get confronted with the words of Jews are like this or Arabs are like that. And for us, knowing that we had that connection from a very young age and we had that positive image of each other, we would always say, well, hold on a second, Rita is Jewish, but she's nothing like you're telling us. And very quickly you start understanding that the two main enemies of societies are generalization and ignorance. And for me, that was kind of the catalyst as well of trying to figure out these different programs we can put in place within inside of Israel to allow for these positive encounters to occur already from the get-go, before anyone is able to establish any biases towards the other populations or not. And so I think that was kind of a very important step in that kind of pursuit of shared existence and advocating for that inclusive society. Because I myself lived it in my neighborhood. You see, Enayam Wadi Jmal, the reason I also always say both names is because this is something that the neighborhood has really promoted and advocated from the get-go, because of the understanding that it shouldn't be a case of one history overshadowing the other. En Hayam means in Hebrew, eye of the sea, whereas Wadi Jmal in Arabic, depending on how you pronounce it, it could actually mean Valley of Camels or Valley of Beauty. Now, I am biased. I would rather it to be Valley of Beauty, but historically speaking, it is Valley of Camels. It used to be a pit stop for lots of traders back in the days. And I remember the stories from my grandpa as well on that neighborhood. But what I mean about not letting any history overshadow the other, it really had to do with a group of anthropology, urban anthropologists and social entrepreneurs from within our neighborhood, who gathered together to try and understand how we can take this shared existence that we have a step forward, and really be able to kind of share that with the world. And so they came up with this thing called Sovev Enayam Wadi Jmal, which means in Hebrew, around Enayam Wadi Jmal neighborhood. And it was a tour that is, until today, we actually have many groups that come and join on this walking tour. In fact, it was also selected as one of the Jane walks. If you're not familiar with Jane walks, they are to do with urban anthropology tours around the world. So Enayam Wadi Jmal got to actually be selected as one of them, and it's on their suggested tours around the world. And throughout this tour, when you have all these various stops, you have both histories side by side, again, from that respect and that understanding of not letting one history overshadow the other, and understanding how important it is to have the various narratives and be respectful and give the platform to those narratives. Now, unfortunately, Enayam Wadi Jmal is not necessarily the common, I would say, neighborhood model, not in Haifa and not in Israel itself. And in fact, it's very much the exception. When we think about Haifa, even though Haifa definitely has this notion of being the city of multiculturalism, the city of shared existence, when we look at the data, only 10% of residents, Haifa residents, are actually Arabs. That is the lowest percentage of Arab residents among all the mixed cities in Israel, be it Akko, be it Tel Aviv Yaffa, be it as well Jerusalem or Lod, where each one of them has between 20 to 25% Arab residents. But the reason Haifa definitely gets that status and that kind of association has to do with many variables, be it first and foremost that Haifa is the third largest city in Israel, and it's located up in the north and is seen as the capital of the north. And the north of Israel is also very much populated by Arab populations that go into and that come into Haifa on the daily to work, to be able to kind of socialize. And so on your day-to-day activities, if we put aside the resident percentage, you probably do get about 30 to 40% Arabs that you would see on the daily. So that's kind of one of them in the sense of the, I would say kind of the representation that you would see on your daily life and daily activities in Haifa is quite high. So you have this association as if there's definitely more Arabs living in Haifa than there is actually according to the statistics. On the other hand, though, already from the get-go after the establishment of the State of Israel and when we had the mayor of Haifa, Hassan Shukri, what they ended up doing is actually appointing their deputy as an Arab citizen. And that was already sending a very clear message to the population that we are all here on the same boat. So we might as well figure out how to live together pretty soon. And I think that's quite important in that kind of, again, narrative building, place branding, and that issue that distinguishes Haifa from the rest of the mixed cities in Israel. The other one that I definitely feel very strongly about, and that is the notion of really having more so respect rather than simply tolerance. And what I mean about that is you will often see times where people are tolerating others who think differently and act differently. But just because you tolerate someone doesn't mean you're actually respecting their opinion. And that is something we see in Haifa quite a lot, is more so of that sense of respect. And at the end of the day, when you're respecting someone who, again, may hold a very different opinion than yours, you're still respecting them. And there's a bit more of a layer to that relationship that we see coming to into representation in Haifa itself. But you see, when we look and kind of zoom out maybe a little bit from Haifa to the rest of Israel, the population inside of Israel, when we're thinking about it, 20% of Israelis are actually Arabs. In fact, 25% of Israelis are not even Jewish. So having 1 out of 4 Israelis not even speaking Hebrew as their mother tongue is quite a massive minority group that we see in Israel. That 25% really breaks down to 20% Arabs, both Christians and Muslims, 1% Druze, and the reason I put them in their own category is out of respect to their own self-determination as a group and category. And then we have 4% that are non-Jewish, as well as non-Arab population in Israel. And so for me, that also ignited quite a lot of the times this notion that the story of the minority groups from within Israel is very much lost or perhaps even unheard of when we go beyond the borders of Israel. Every time I would travel and I would say I'm from Israel, or they would see that I have an Israeli passport and we would talk, they would always end up kind of telling me how, they would say Shabbat Shalom, or they would say how much they love Jews. And I would always tell them, this is amazing, but it's, it's a shame because I'm actually not Jewish. It doesn't actually apply to me. And they always end up being left very confused because they're like, but you said you're from Israel. And I say, yes, but 25% of Israelis are actually not Jewish. And so I think that's really where a lot of that motivation comes from, is telling the story of the minority groups of Israel, having a bit more of an understanding of Israeli society in today's world and what does it actually encompasses, as well as pointing to those issues in which the Arab minority and in general the non-Jewish minority in Israel, pointing out to the challenges that they face in their daily life as citizens of Israel, be it through education and lack of good quality education in the public sector, point that we have quite a high rise and high number of private Arabic speaking schools to fill that need for good quality education. be it from infrastructure of having the ability to, have good public transportation, good infrastructure in their villages and cities. And that is quite a sore issue for the Arab population in Israel, because oftentimes when they are trying to basically advocate for that equality in that sector, they are put down by simply saying, oh, it's, you're in the periphery, it's just, it has nothing to do with Arab or ethnicities, it simply has to do with the fact, the geographical distance that you are in. But that I would have accepted had there not been a Jewish, for example, town right next door that is having good infrastructure in place and does have public transportation. And so when you start seeing this disparities between those kind of social and public provisions from the state of Israel, you start also realizing why oftentimes a lot of the Arab population actually doesn't feel a sense of belongingness to the state of Israel, and in fact actually feel neglected. I stand in front of you saying that I am an Arab Israeli and I hold a hyphened identity, but I still can't say I'm only Israeli, because I don't feel yet 100% Israeli. There are still some issues as a citizen that I feel we need to address for me to have that sense of belongingness. But I also have the responsibility to share the census, or perhaps as well the various different identities that people, Arab citizens of Israel, hold, be it those that have a hyphened identity of Palestinian Israeli, seeing the Palestinian as part of their kind of cultural background and heritage, and whereas Israeli as their nationality, or when we see also citizens who say that they are Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they don't associate themselves with Israel, or saying Arabs who live in Israel, or simply Arabs as well, to avoid this whole confusion around Arab Israeli. And so I feel like there's quite a lot of importance to try and understand, well, why is that they don't feel that sense of belongingness to the state of Israel, and how can we actually address that to create a more inclusive society in Israel by looking and examining these social problems, social issues, often neglected as well. Now, we do see in recent years quite a lot of focus to do with the employment rates that we see. And what I mean about that is oftentimes if we just have a look at kind of the employment rates among Arabs and Jews, but also in fact that the employment rates of Arab women as well, they are very low. Just to give you a bit of an example, the employment rates among the Arab women in Israel currently stands at 36%, compared to 83% of employment rate among the Jewish women. That is a huge, a gap between them. Now, obviously, a lot of from research that has gone into this to try and understand why this is the case, we have seen that, the three main barriers were the cultural barrier, which is not just for, it's not just special for the Arab women in Israel, but it's rather actually the case across the MENA region, and it's referred to as the MENA paradox, where you see high rates of education attainments and education levels, but very low rates of labor force participation. But the other one also had to do with public transportation, with having job opportunities as well in the periphery. And so these are things that the current government as well as the previous one have been trying to figure out how to address by sending an influx of social investment to that, and figuring out again, how do we push it, because at the end of the day, it's also a win-win situation for the state of Israel from a GDP point of view and economical benefit. And Benjamin Netanyahu back in 2016, actually in January 2016, had pushed that program. But what I would say is education or employment are not enough. There are so many other problems or social, neglections that we see that still need to be addressed. And that is a place where I'm interested in. And so as of right now, I finished my 2 masters in Oxford University. I did an MSc in comparative social policy, as well as an MPP, which is a Master of Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. And so a lot of my focus had been around welfare policy, social policy, and I've looked into Israel as my case study in all of the research I've done, be it through health, education, and so on. And Right now, I am actually based in Italy, in Florence, where I'm doing a policy leaders fellowship at the European University Institute. And there I'm looking at kind of digital and fiscal policies as other ways to try and promote that inclusivity for marginalized communities. And so I hope to be able to really kind of contribute in that knowledge and understand what are the various policies that we could, push forward and implement in Israel, and how do we also understand looking into not just the policies that need improvement in Israel, but also the policies that exist in Israel and are quite good, and how we can export them to the rest of the world. One of which does happen to be the Chok Liron, the law, Liron law in Israel, which came into act to help the integration of people with disabilities into the labor force market. And that was a very innovative way of thinking about stipends and integration of people with disabilities into the workforce. And so how are we able also to take those things and try to export them abroad? And so right now I'm actually also working on a case study, writing it for master students at the European Universities Institute, as well as the executive trainings that they have, to again allow us to go beyond, whenever we're talking about Israel in the international arena, to go beyond simply just always talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, obviously, I have my opinion on that, and I do understand the importance of it. But at the same time, I realize that with lots of attention that goes there, less attention is also going towards the issues that we're seeing within inside of Israel and within the various populations in Israel. And that's where I feel like I can contribute most. And so I've been focusing most of my work on that issue. I think for me personally, I can genuinely talk for forever about stuff to do with Israel and with marginalized communities and inclusivity, and try to advocate and champion that approach. And I know that in today's world as well, we are in a very precarious kind of situation, because inside of Israel right now, we don't actually really have a very strong, solid Israeli identity. And what I mean by that is, we're about to celebrate about 75 years, for example, but we always refer to the population inside of Israel as Jews and Arabs, not Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Druze, and so on. And there is a reason for that. And that has to do with the fact that a lot of the Jewish population inside of Israel see their Judaism as both a nationality as well as a religion, or depending on the spiritual levels of their own kind of, be it cultural or religious. And so we see that. And therefore, what it tells me is, on the one hand, it is a bit surprising that even, with 70 odd years, we still don't have that clear Israeli identity. But on the other hand, it actually is quite, to me at least, I see them as good news, because it means that in today's world, where we do have such emphasis and we do pay attention to, inclusivity and diversity, then we actually have a great opportunity to cultivate an Israeli identity that is inclusive of the entire population, including the 25% non-Jewish population of Israel. And so to me, kind of, that's what really, I would say, at the end of my mind is always that, is looking forward to the future. How do we help build or cultivate that identity? How do we better integrate the minority and marginalized group, be it the Arab group, be it as well the people with disabilities as a marginalized group, be it the women, and so on. And also, how do we tell that story to the world, and how do we are able to raise awareness to those voices and to understand the complexities and the nuances that come with a place that for many people abroad simply see it as black and white. And that is not the case. It simply isn't. I see myself as a nuance to begin with, but I'm just one out of many voices from the region. And I think that, to me, the important thing is really to allow for that discussion to happen, to have this, exchange of ideas and knowledge on this issue, because that's the only way that we can really move forward. And so perhaps if, if you're interested, I'd really like to open it for a discussion and be able to delve a bit deeper into issues that interest you, from either something I've mentioned during the talk or actually something you're interested in and I haven't made, I didn't pay attention to it or didn't mention. I'm more than happy, and I truly do welcome that as well. But thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to discussing.
Thank you, Lian. I actually have a number of questions, and if you don't mind, I'll ask a few first and then open it up to other people. So first of all, I'm just curious, how do you account for the fact that there are so few resources being given to the Arab communities? Is it prejudice? I mean, is there a real deliberate decision not to give them the same resources as the next town over that's Jewish? I mean, how do you account for it?
Yeah, there's really two things here to do with that. One is, over the years, especially in the last few decades, we have had mainly a right-wing government that wasn't really at the top priority for the policymakers. They didn't really make much of an effort to try and understand how do you move budgets around to fit that. Except for that example I gave back in 2006, where Benjamin Netanyahu tried to push this kind of social investments and trying to have an influx of cash, or I would say kind of, money towards, bettering job opportunities, or bettering like public transportation. But in general, there hasn't been that actual desire to put it at the top of priority, at the top of your priority list for many of the politicians. Now, the other thing that I don't necessarily agree with that much is this notion that we hear people simply say, politicians saying, oh, we gave the budgets, but whoever is the head of council at that town or village, they probably are corrupt and taking the money to themselves. And to me, even if that is true, then that notion, as a politician, as a public servant, knowing that there is corruption happening and not doing anything about it, not looking the other way when taxpayers' money is being kind of taken advantage of, and we're seeing that corruption, and not even putting in place a Knesset, a parliament committee to explore this. I find this bizarre to allow it to even happen, even if that is the case, which often is not actually, but even if it were, and I want to go that hypothetical route, the fact that you would say, oh yeah, it's happening, but I don't care about it, or I'll just let it happen again, is just unacceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable by anyone, neither the Arab community nor the Jewish community in Israel, because it really goes down to that point of efficient and effective governance. And that is something that every single citizen should have the right to have.
Right. And as you said, it is pretty self-defeating to starve a particular community and then have crime or, low employment and unhealthy conditions and all of that. Yeah. So the other question, one of my other questions is, so the symbols of Israel are all Jewish, right? The national anthem is Hatikva. The flag is like a talit. The calendar is Jewish. So how does that feel for an Arab Israeli to be living, in a place where, I mean, it's 20% is not a small percentage, so you're living in a place where everything is really related to another group. So how does that work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just a quick comment as well on what you were saying, kind of to do with the other question about the crime rates or the unemployment. One of the things we've definitely seen that it did come up in the kind of top priority for some parliament members, Jewish parliament members from both the Yesh Atid party and Blue and White as well, has been the crime rates, because we are seeing the safety and security for citizens, regardless the ethnic background. And they've seen that crime rates is really one of the biggest motivators and kind of, I would say, pushing forces has been the lack of employment rates, especially among Arab men. And so right now we're seeing lots of, through the Innovation Authority of the Israeli government, we're seeing grants being given to NGOs, charities, and individuals who are coming up with ideas to address the unemployment rates for young men between the ages of 18 to 24. So I hope that will also kind of help us reduce the rates, the crime rates, and have more security, as well as giving career prospects and educational prospects. But to come back to your second question, I think you're absolutely right, especially when you have a 20% Arab minority, and in general 25% of non-Jewish minority, to have these symbols of Judaism. How does it connect? My simple answer would be that, number one, if I put the anthem to the side for a second and look at the menorah, or look at the flag of Israel with the David star and the colors of the talit, this is something that probably a few years ago I would say, oh, I didn't feel connected to, the flag of Israel because it just didn't represent me. But I had a discussion, and I always try and learn all the time during my talks, and kind of take, reflect on the questions and the discussions we've had. And in one of them, someone asked me, and they said that, well, what happens with also all the Jews who lived in Arab countries in which their flags were Islamic symbols? What about the Jewish and Muslim populations living in, for example, Scandinavia, or even, the UK or Scotland, where their flags are, the St. Andrew's crest or other symbols of Christianity? And so that made me kind of understand that I shouldn't necessarily, the fact that this flag is representing a specific religion that's not mine, shouldn't mean that I shouldn't look at it as my flag as a citizen of the state of Israel. And so I've had that, my own journey of coming to accepting that flag as mine. And, it's not, I won't say that I'm like wrapping myself with the flag and running about, but I definitely take pictures with it, or I use it when I'm trying to describe who I am. And that is good to see. And I'm not calling to change the flag or anything like that. But then on the other hand, if we do look at the tikva, then one of the main things is actually, we have 25% of the Israeli population completely, simply not represented in that anthem. When you're talking about a Jewish soul, I know the words of the tikva, I know the rhyme, I will respect it and stand, but I will always be silent, and I will never sing it until there is a verse in that anthem that speaks to the 25% non-Jewish population in Israel. I'm not saying to alter it, I'm not saying to change it, I'm simply asking for adding one verse to speak for those who are not Jewish. So I can also, as a citizen, have an anthem. Now, I personally am a political animal in that sense, where I do feel a bit of a hole when I actually don't have an anthem to sing to. I don't sing the Palestinian anthem because I simply don't necessarily relate to it in that sense. Yes, I am an Arab Israeli of Palestinian heritage, but I don't feel Palestinian today. I feel Israeli, Arab Israeli. And so being stuck between those two people, two nations, without having any anthem that represents me, or I feel a sense of belongingness to, is a bit of a, as if I have this missing piece, as they say. But I definitely think it's important to look into reforming it and adding that verse. And in fact, I've had conversations with Jewish friends of mine who are Mizrahis, and they themselves said to me that they actually don't feel represented, because the way it speaks of how you're looking at Zion and in Israel, it's coming from a European direction. And I never even paid attention to that. And so that was very interesting for me to learn. So that obviously speaks to the fact that it is about time that we think and rethink and add these verses to make sure the population is feeling seen, and is feeling heard, and it's feeling represented. And that's one of those inclusive policies we can really help to promote. And so to me, that's kind of one of those things. Now, obviously, these are the main symbols, but then, it begs the question as well, when we think about Israel and the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, it says Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Now, first of all, as a political scientist major and so on, the fact that you have those two words side by side and knowing that they clash, it causes so much confusion.
Right.
But I do ask myself the question, and many others as well back in Israel too, what do we mean by saying a Jewish state? Are we talking about completely following the halakha? Are we talking about the judiciary system being completely according to the Jewish laws? Are we talking about transportation in terms of Shabbat and so on, completely shut? What is it that we're seeing? Because 70% of Israeli Jews are actually identifying as secular Jews. And so aren't you also restricting the right of movement for people who wish to use public transportation on a Shabbat and don't have the necessary means to have a car or get a private taxi? And so Haifa, which I'm, if you haven't gotten, if you didn't get it by now, but I'm a very proud Haifa citizen resident. And for me, I'm always very proud of the fact that they do have public transportation on a Shabbat in Haifa. But at the same time, with that notion of respect, the population, the ultra-Orthodox population is kind of located in a very central, they're all kind of together in a cluster of one of the neighborhoods. And so the way they've sorted it is for the buses to go around that. So they're still respecting them. But again, with that fact that we still have it in place for those who wish to use it. And so that's a question that I think lots of politicians, now I do understand, especially nowadays with all the political turmoil we're seeing back home, it's not again at the top of the list, but it is a question to ask for the vision and the future of Israel by what do we mean by Jewish, and how do we see that coming to reality?
So what do you think the chances are of adding a line to the Hatikva that would include, non-Jews? Do you think is there any movement towards that?
Not that I know of in terms of actively pursuing that change. I know that it has been talked about. I have been thinking about it for quite a long time now, to be honest. And, it might be a point where I would also wish to perhaps get that glove and take that glove off and try to push that activism towards it. But I do think there is a high chance in it. And as long as we have the right actors, the right political allies, and also the political will for that to happen. And so it would really kind of require quite a lot of chit-chatting and lots of brainstorming to understand what would be the right phrase or verses that we can add that everyone will feel comfortable singing, including the Jewish singing those verses, but also the Arabs singing the Jewish verses as well. And I don't think that it is an unfetched dream or reality, but I do truly believe it is something achievable. I do feel like it will come. I just think that we just need to wait for the right political will and push for it if it's not there as well.
Okay, so my last question is not a small one. It's the issue of the West Bank and Palestinian. So can you address that at all? I mean, it seems to have been off the table for a very long time. And so can you tell us what you think is going to happen and how it's going to happen?
So let me ask you that though, to just try and clarify, because you're right, the issue is also very large to try and encapsulate all of it. And so if you were to focus it on something, I would say, what would that be?
Well, I mean, what are the chances of a two-state solution at this point? I mean, given the fact that settlements are spreading around, and taking more and more of the land over there, whether it's East Jerusalem or other parts, Area C in the West Bank, it seems like there's less and less of a chance every year that there's the possibility of a real two-state solution. So do you see any prospects for that?
I see. I think, okay, so in general, like we said, it's very hard to try and put everything together in a very short amount of time. But what I do think is quite important is this notion when we're thinking about a two-state solution and the future of it. I'll preface by saying that I personally am pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. And what I mean by that is I do wish to see the realization and self-determination of the Palestinian people towards a Palestinian state. I myself have family as well in the West Bank. And then on the other hand, I also do wish to see that Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state, that both of them are flourishing. And so that's what I mean with this notion, especially because like I said, to do a lot of the times in the US, there's this dichotomy lens of black and white in the region, and this notions that I've seen even on campuses where people feel like if they are, saying that they're pro-Israeli, then they must be anti-Palestinian or vice versa. And I feel like it's very important to try and push for people to understand that you can be both. And so that's kind of, to put my own position to begin with. But I feel like it's quite important to zoom out for a second and think about the fact that for the past 2 decades in foreign policy, we've seen everyone putting on the table this concept of, oh, I'm for two-state solution, without truly actually thinking about what does that really look like. Like you said, be it with the settlements that we're seeing, which I am personally against. I do feel like Israel should respect the 1967 lines, the green lines, and allow for the Palestinians to have the West Bank according to the what they've agreed way back then. I don't think it's necessarily lost, even with the growing settlements, because we've seen Ariel Sharon back in 2001 withdrawing from Gaza. Now, I do understand that obviously the results or the sequences that happen afterwards are not encouraging Israel to try and do the same with the West Bank, and I completely understand where it's coming from. But I do know that if it was a decision to be taken by the government, then it will be executed in that sense. Now, personally, there would also be a question at that point that if we do see a Palestinian state, if the Jewish population who are there, and that Jewish population also, you can categorize it by various motives. Some are there and they're very honest and blunt about it. They're simply there because we don't really have good housing policy in Israel, and the prices are really insane. And they actually say that they're there because the houses are cheaper. So their motives is not necessarily from a very, urge or strong urge or desire to be there because it's the Judea and so on. So to me, it's quite interesting to understand the population that are residing there and settling there. On the other hand, we see those that are very much adamant that this is, to them, that is a holy place and they want to stay there. And so would they actually accept to become, Jewish Palestinians, just like we have Arab Israelis? I don't really know what would that look like. Now, I think that for me, and again, kind of zooming back a bit, even geographically speaking, we have the West Bank, we have Israel, and we have Gaza. How do you plan to connect the West Bank and Gaza together if you do see a two-state solution, for example? We've heard other people who try to put in, how Gaza can become the next Singapore and therefore have a three-state solution instead. We've seen people who said for Jordan to take the West Bank and Egypt to take Gaza, but then it defeats the purpose of the Palestinian state and self-realization. And so there's all these questions. There's others who say a one-state solution with a federalist system, or having a new state to kind of come to place. But me being pragmatic and very honest, I don't think a one-state solution will happen anytime soon, simply from the fact that right now, in a 9 million citizens of Israel, 2 and a bit of them millions are Arabs. Combining with the 5 million in the West Bank and in Gaza, that's about 7-7 in terms of the population. And then there's also that risk of Israel being that Jewish safe haven for Jews, right? So being pragmatic and being very understanding and honest about the situation, it's not necessarily something I'm seeing. What I would urge, though, and that's something that even I include myself in that as well, and that is we all need to simply take that whole concept of just throwing the name two-state solution aside and come in and just brainstorm again, because clearly we need to be innovative. We need to bring that entrepreneurial spirit and innovation that we see in Israel to this arena of diplomacy as well, and come up with something that would really meet the needs of the population. And I think for that to also be done, it's very important to be done by the people on the ground who will actually deal with the consequences of whatever new lines will be drawn there, and not simply merely imposed on them. And so I need, for me, I genuinely mean it when I say I don't know what the future would look like. I feel like simply saying a two-state solution is actually trying to take the easy way out when we're thinking about there. And I'm not for it. I'm for, discussing. I'm for having these conflicts or arguments, but in a respectful manner. I'm for trying to rethink this whole situation, because it's also, for me at least, also inhumane for lots of Palestinians to be born, to live, and to die as refugees. I think that it is about time that we are thinking of how do we also look at the Palestinian population. And then at the same time, for Israel, doing a zoom in, I would say in the Israel population, I feel like if we do promote, and I truly do believe in that, if we do promote the political, social, and economical inclusion of the Arab society in Israel, then we stand even better chances at sitting in those negotiation tables with the Palestinians, and the Arab-Israeli population could play a pivotal role in kind of reaching that, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, not as simple. Okay, Judy, please go ahead.
Yeah, first I want to say you're wonderful, and I'm just thrilled to have met you and excited about the possibility that there are lots of other young people who have your spirit and awareness. It's just magnificent. But I worry. I'm still worried. I'm very worried. And I wonder, to what degree do you see the absence of a political solution as preventing the kind of investments in Arab welfare, Arab Israeli welfare, education, job possibilities? I should say, if you want to know where I am on this, my daughter is the executive director of UNRWA USA. So my Jewish daughter is, but so, we care.
Judy, for those who don't know what that is, can you explain?
United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is devoted to the cause of Palestinian refugees. And she's been just, concerned with the underdog her whole life. So, but we are Jewish, but I still struggle with the idea that enough can be done to promote diversity, to invest in roads, invest in job creation, job seeking tools, all those things that are needed worldwide in so many populations, when the political solution, the absence of the political solution, just stays there, and it goes with an ideology on the right that is concerned about the size of the Arab Israeli population, and there's not yet sufficient representation, is there, in the Knesset? So even politically, in that sense, how can that dream of a diverse, inclusive society, which is what all of us on the left want for every country that we live in or don't live in, how can that occur when there's that barrier and the thinking, the ideological thinking on the right that's really worried about the Arab population growing in size? In other words, isn't there horribly so? Isn't there a tendency not to make this investment because it would encourage Arab settlement? I mean, I know that sounds horrible, but isn't that part of the truth? So I worry about that whole aspect of things,
No, thank you, Judy, for your question and for your thoughtful, comments. You've touched on many different things, and I do agree with you on that notion that having that absence of a political solution is a hurdle, is a barrier towards this future of inclusivity and diversity. We even see it with the Arab Joint List, for example, which is kind of, is seen as the major representative of Arab needs, when in fact is also not necessarily the case, actually. And what I mean by that is their main argument to why they don't join the coalition is because they don't want to join the coalition unless the coalition is going to be very active on finding a solution to the Palestinian, cause. And I think that on the one hand, even though I understand where it's coming from, because at the end of the day, we are all, before the establishment of the state of Israel, we were all Palestinians. My family has been in Haifa for 300 years as well. And so having that understanding of that kind of responsibility or notion to try and help the Palestinian people from the representation within Israel, I do see it. But then on the other hand, I don't believe that that should be an ultimatum for joining the coalition and actually representing those that have casted and exercised their democratic right of voting for someone to be there and represent their needs and their challenges, which, trust me, there are so many for the Arab society. And so I feel like if we look at the Arab Joint List we are seeing that lack of opportunities to actually engage because of that main political hurdle or political solution. And it's a real shame. Whereas I'm quite happy, even though my political views don't align with those of Mansour Abbas and Ram, I am very appreciative that they have broken the taboo. After 75 years, they have broken the taboo of political participation and integration of Arab parties in the coalition.
Yeah.
My hope is that that would push a bit more of this understanding of how do you create and how do you push for this population, or I would say the how do you push for that integration? Other things to note as well is actually, be it Labour Party and Meretz having Arab representatives who are different in the voice they have than those in the Arab joint list, and a bit more kind of paying more attention to the Arab society through these parties. That's quite good. And to be honest, I would definitely encourage more of that. You know, there was a poll recently as well that was done back in 2019 and 20, where Arab citizens of Israel were asked, would you vote for a Jewish party if they were representing your needs? And 44% of those asked answered yes, because at the end of the day, we simply also want to see that social justice and social equality. Now, on the other hand, when we are thinking about kind of the Jewish or the right-wing population, it's something we also see quite often in Israel, and that is this incitement towards different groups and creating that segregation in the language and so on. And so that just pushes me more to this understanding that it is important for Jewish leaderships and Jewish political parties to kind of take that steps forward and show how integral the Arab minority is to the functioning of the state of Israel. Yesh Atid and Blue and White, for example, in these recent years have really put a lot of efforts into, first and foremost, creating like an Arab headquarter where they're focusing mainly on the Arab voters as well. Now, yes, I do understand there's a political interest here because for the center parties in Israel, this is 20% of a population that they can tap in as voters to help them gain the extra votes against the right, for example. And so I understand there's that political interest, but at the same time, that political interest is still serving the social and welfare policies for the Arab population. Now, I think that in general, even when we're looking at what's happening in Palestine, like for example, with the recent unfortunate terror attacks in the center, we've seen for the first time Abu Mazen, Abbas actually coming and condemning them publicly, which has never been done
Interesting.
before. And so that kind of also is talking about this desire from the Palestinian people to try and understand how they can work with this new government, because for the first time, we're also seeing that talks happening to begin with, just simply to talk about it. It's something that both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people need to understand, that we must sit and talk. There's nothing else that will come and solve it magically, instead, except of doing that. And other things that oftentimes people are not aware of, and that, if we do look at the Palestinian population in the West Bank, 90% of the youth are unemployed. And this is ridiculous to think about it. We know what happens when the youth is not employed. We know that from an economical development point of view, it's not going to be good. And I think that for me, that's an opportunity again. And it might be just my mindset of always trying to find this kind of various, I would say, opportunities in those challenges, because in my personal life with my disability, it was always that mindset of like, okay, don't let the things that you can do interfere with the things you can do. And so I think for me, it's the same when it comes to life in Israel as as well as to the Palestinians and Israelis. So we see this unemployment among youth. I would really try and encourage for people, instead of, putting lots of negative energy towards Israel, to actually try and put their resources towards lifting up and trying to support economically as well the Palestinian people and the Palestinian businesses. One thing that a lot of people are never aware of it is actually Israel is the only one that gives work permits from the neighboring countries. The only one that gives work permits for Palestinians to go inside to Israel, whereas Jordan also shares a border with Palestine, with the West Bank, and Egypt also shares a border with Gaza. So, and yet we only see it happening actually, for example, in the West Bank, we're only seeing that migration of workers during the day between the West Bank and
Yeah.
Israel and inside of the West Bank. So that's also other questions towards these various other actors that can play a major role here, be it Jordan or Egypt. Now, Egypt is now playing a huge role in the reconstruction of Gaza. They've opened their border. They are employing lots of Gaza people in the kind of, rebuilding the community, as well as the streets and the buildings, the physical buildings, with the recent, obviously, wars we've seen. And so we're looking and we're understanding that they are interested. And of course, they're doing that also in collaboration with Israel, that are also allowing for that transition of resources to rebuild. And so, but a lot of people are not aware of it. And I think that if we do talk about it, then we're trying to show that it's not as black and white and it's so complex, but there is a desire by certain political leaders, there is a desire by certain population within inside of Israel. But yes, at the same time, I will not shy away from the fact that we still see racism happening, be it from the Jewish side that is very vocal about their desire to not have Arabs be included at all, even the Arab citizens of Israel, or also from Arab population who have no desire either of integrating or engaging or having that, racism towards them. And I think it's important to note them, but also at the same time to keep pushing and believing that that's not the majority, but rather a minority. It's a loud minority at this point, especially, but it's very important to keep that in mind. But thank
That
you.
helps.
Sandy,
I have a question. I have a question about, you were talking about the number of women who are unemployed, the Arab women. Is language a part of that problem? Do they not speak Hebrew?
Yeah, so in Israel, in Arabic speaking schools, you are taught Hebrew from the 2nd grade until the 12th grade. So you're basically taught it for about 10 years. And all of them would know how to read it, how to talk, but not necessarily, especially if they're living in not in mixed cities, they wouldn't be using the language on a daily basis. And we all know what happens when you don't use a language on a daily basis. You don't feel comfortable or confident enough to speak in it. And so definitely there is that aspect of language literacy in the integration. And perhaps that's where it's quite important to try and think about creation of jobs that cater for the Arab population in which they can speak in Arabic. In just a recent talk I've had in, I believe it was in the East Coast, it was at Temple University. And I was kind of told to look into and examine the efforts that were made by the Israeli government towards the integration of ultra-Orthodox women into the labor force, because their labor participation is very high. And one of the barriers they had was that religious barrier. And so what they ended up doing is creating lots of work environments that were women only, to allow for the community, the ultra-Orthodox community, not to meet or not to give much resistance to those efforts to integrate them. And so that's potentially also something that we can look at for the Arab population, where the cultural barrier can be one of those things. And therefore we can create those work environments that are women only, or perhaps create hybrid formats or digital work as well. Obviously in recent years with COVID, we've seen the rise for it, and we know that it can happen. So perhaps we can capitalize on that. And I think in general, oftentimes we do think about social norms as somewhat of a restriction or restricting, but I also feel like social norms can sometimes also be enablers. And just like a seatbelt is a social norm that enables safety, we can, if we try and switch that mindset and that understanding that not every single Western value can simply be copy pasted into a society that has lived very differently. Perhaps with that understanding of that adaptation, we can work with the community rather than against it, to help female empowerment and to help for those kind of societies to be able to progress and develop sustainably as well.
I have a,
Go ahead,
That's
Judy.
very
Do you have a, oh,
very-
Sandy?
just a quick question. Did I hear you say you were Ishmaeli?
Sorry,
Did I hear you say you were Ishmaeli?
what's Ishmaeli?
You're not. When you were talking real fast, it sounded like you said you were Ishmaeli.
No, no, I don't know.
I think you were talking about the community that, you know, that tour
Yeah.
goes to, that one
Okay.
area. I think that's what you were referring to.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Is that like, was it about the Jane Walks like tour in
Yeah, I
Ayam?
think so.
Okay, yeah, no, it's a community. It's just a, you know, it's a beautiful, gorgeous neighborhood, and it's just how it's about 2,500 residents, and it's very, you know, in the south of Haifa, right in front of the beach. Is great. If you're ever in Haifa, I highly recommend visiting it. And if you want to do the walk, it's you can search it on Jane Walks, but you can also write around Enayam Wadi Jmal, which is in Hebrew Sovev Enayam Wadi Jmal. It's called.
Okay, thank you.
Are there
Can you
other,
put that, can you put that in the chat, that name of that?
Of course. Let me see.
or you
So
can always email it to me and I can email it out to people if that's easier.
let's do that because
Yeah.
then I can give you the actual link.
Yes,
as well.
Right,
And-
right. Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. You're wonderful.
Thank you.
Um,
Sherry. Thank
You
Are
should
there-
run for office in Israel.
Yes.
You know what? She's going to do great things. We're going to hear about her. I'm telling you. I told her when I pre-interviewed her, I said, one day you're going to do big things and I hope you'll still take my phone calls. So other questions? Judy, do you have any follow-ups or?
No, I think that was a great answer and very illuminating. I mean, I'm sure that I suspect strongly that it's the case that all these years of living together in some places, at least within Israel, lead to the development of psyches like yours, and that there's got to be some other people with some of the same understandings and resilience and ability to look at non-regulation paths and to think creatively. And that is the hope, surely, for the future.
you. I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you, Lian, if you are an exception or if there are other people who share your point of view.
Yeah, growing up, I used to think I was a bit of an exception when I was going outside of the neighborhood, because all those that live in the neighborhood truly have that mindset, or at least for the most part, all of them, most of them do. And so I used to think I was the exception, but in recent years, after talking and addressing political issues with many of my friends who I thought didn't really think the same as I do, one thing came very strong, and that's really that desire of simply being a citizen, being a taxpayer, wanting that inclusion, wanting that personal and professional development, and seeing beyond the simple ethnic backgrounds divisions. But also when it comes to even the identity, I used to, back in I think it was like 10th grade or 11th grade in high school, I was in a civic class and we were asked how we identify ourselves. I was the last one to speak that day, and I was also the only one who ever said I was an Arab Israeli.
Wow.
And I remember the stares I got from people of even thinking about including Israeli as part of my identity, even though it was hyphen, it still is as well. But that same like poll that I was referring to that asked Arab citizens of Israel what would they like if they would vote for a Jewish party if it represented them. So in that same poll, they also asked them, how do you identify yourself? And in fact, they've seen a rise from 2014 to 2019 in the percentage of people, Arab citizens of Israel, identifying as Arab Israelis.
Wow.
In fact, 46% of those that answered the poll said they refer and identify as Arab Israelis. And that has been definitely a shift that is to do, a gradual shift to do with various social and welfare policies and narrative building that is trying to integrate the Arab society and understanding it's not going anywhere. So we might as well figure out a future in which we're all together. And so I'm more and more in recent years coming to the realization that, and gladly as well, a pleasant realization that I'm not the only one. Or I'm not an exception, but rather the younger population is trying to think beyond and looking forward to the future.
That is really encouraging. Thank you so much. And Lian, thank you so much for enlightening us and for your wonderfully open attitude, and I know you're going to make a big difference in the world. And we're going to look forward to following your journey.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So
so
very
thank,
much.
thank you so much.
Lightning.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye,
And yeah,
everybody.
as well.
Hi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again.
Thank you.